I do wish to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay tribute to their history, their culture and their ongoing struggles for land, for rights and for humanity. I also am very much want to acknowledge what's happening in Gaza and Palestine at the moment. The deaths continue to rise, the abuse, and all these people are out to do is to claim their rights, and like with all refugees, they should have the right of return. And the Great March of Return is the essence of those 35 to 40,000 people gathered on the border of Gaza at the moment. So welcome, very big welcome to the first of our talks about 1968, Days of Hope, Days of Rage. That we're very fortunate. Thanks very much for joining us, Helen. Helen's from Melbourne, so she's come up to join with us to kick off this first event. And this event has been organised by the Greens New South Wales Industrial Relations Working Group, the Greens Political Education Trust and our office, and a particular thanks to Hall Greenlands, who's helped give a lot of direction for this whole event. I was 17 in 1968, and when I think back on it, it was certainly a year of phenomenal change, great hope and uncertainty. Also a lot of fun, I've got to say. And in many ways it did feel like the old world was falling apart, and for a while I suppose it really did. That's what you'll be seeing in many of those images before you tonight. But then we'll be exploring what comes after it. But I thought to give it some context, it's actually just worth thinking about 1968 and the 1960s, because in one way it was a period of incredible conformity and just this sameness. Like once you'd hit 1968, we'd have the same government, the Conservatives, for 19 years. They ended up being in power for 23 years. Like there's superpowers, the US, the USSR, we're in the middle of the Cold War, you know, and that just seemed to go on forever as well. Meanwhile, the Vietnam War's raging, which just was extraordinary, with this little country really keeping the so-called mighty US at bay. And then in Australia itself, there was, like in terms of how just this sameness, like quite seriously, food was really pretty ordinary. Like it was 3 meat and veg most nights. When it came to football, St George won 11 times in a row. And so the years just rolled on, and elections were barely worth getting excited about or following because of all that. But meanwhile, there was this undercurrent coming up. I can remember sitting at school in the playground, and some my friends had brought the Thurunka and some of the other student papers to school from their older siblings, and sitting there reading out some pretty extraordinary things for to hear about sex and drugs. So there was the sex, drugs, and the music was pretty good as well. So there was these undercurrents, and periodically things would break out. Like there was the 2 extraordinary assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. The Vietnam War would just explode in different ways, and often there was these regular protests by then about the Vietnam War, so there were sit-ins to participate in. So you could feel that change in the air. I suppose I'm more aware of it when I look back on it. But out of all that, we also get this uprising of some really fantastic social movements that rolled into the 70s, having really far-reaching impacts. Women's liberation, gay liberation, the huge movement to end apartheid, which did take decades, but it was decades as Nelson Mandela paid tribute to that international solidarity. So those social movements arose in a very fundamental way. But then it's like we get in the grip of neoliberalism. So that was partly what triggered us to hold these series of talks. It's not at all really about reminiscing, although our history is something to learn from and I think to celebrate what happens, particularly in France in 1968, but is in the context of what that leads into and the lessons for today. The social movements are on the rise again. So it is my pleasure to be able to introduce Helen. And Helen sent us, when you do these sorts of introductions, you ask the person for their bio. And she sent me a delightful bio, which I'll obviously share with you.
Oh dear.
Helen is a Marxist when she's trying to think, and a writer when she is trying to pay the bills. She has no children, is not married, and is a keen gardener. So you'd have to say that's a pretty good bio. And then, Helen, I actually wanted to share with you a little bit of an additional comments, because when you hold these events, you spread the word, and a couple of people did actually say to me, "Why did you pick Helen? She doesn't like the Greens." So I said, well, I think that's a bit simplistic, but it's actually good for political parties to have critics. And in the context of, I think all political parties it's useful for, but in the context of the challenges that the Greens are facing, I think having critics is very useful. But
it was just that 20 years of mentioning the economy that got to me.
Exactly. So Helen's talked about green mockery, which I thought was quite a delightful term. But Richard Di Natale last year at the National Press Club, the 2017 address that he gave to the National Press Club, did give a really interesting speech.
He mentioned the N-word, neoliberalism.
Yes, precisely. And Helen, I'm not sure if it was admiration or interest or what, but Helen did speak positively about the his work on the current political climate, current political economy, which is what we're out to examine tonight. So please give Helen a very warm welcome.
Thank you so much, Claire. I'm horribly short-sighted, so we're going to come down here so you can see me in my full glory. Anyway, comrades, siblings, and that one dogged foe I know is here who will wait in silence all night if they must to shout sometime at the end, "Marx is a butcher, and you Harridan, excuse all the crimes and murders of Stalin in this country, Australia, made entirely free by peaceful white settlers and made glorious by the song of Delta Goodrum. Welcome to you. I know you fucking here because you always are. Welcome to you all. I'm actually very happy to be here, and I am honoured by the Senator's invitation. I am honoured by the Senator's invitation. It is not a phrase I have ever uttered and will likely not utter again. Not at least after Lee's noble self is swapped for whatever third-way nightmare the Bob Brown hive mind prefers. But thanks to this particular Senator, whose faith in the people eclipses her faith in the parliamentary process, as it should. And thanks to this particular Senator, who sees no unreason in seeking the means for our children's reasonable education. Thanks to this Senator, who thought for some reason that I had something to say about the repertoire of protest in 1968 and beyond, and who didn't give a shit at all that I once wrote that the Greens and their voters were likely to have an unread copy of Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century sitting on their reclaimed ladder bookshelves. Not that I have much against reclaimed ladder bookshelves, but Thomas Piketty, he is, don't be fooled, he is to heterodox economic solutions as Kelly O'Dwyer is to revolutionary feminism. He is to a radical reorganisation of property and the ailing social relations this property determines as, well, the pussy hat is to Paris 1968. And I've just screwed my thing, sorry. I'm legally blind and I'd appreciate it if you just cut me a bit of slack. Anyway. So Paris 1968, pussy hat free. Not a time I will valorise, but there's one graffito of that brief era that I want to share. Hang the last bureaucrat with the guts of the last capitalist. I hope that one's still there. And one more time, hang the last bureaucrat with the guts of the last capitalist. This is a joke, but it is also served for digestion by any anonymous News Corp worker present tonight. Can't have you going home hungry. Can't have you lies about, lean, the common term, not funded. So chew on that, squeeze it out tomorrow, let it live and then let it die in the Murdoch record of imperial excrement. Let it be mangled and let it be misconstrued. Let it not be remembered as it was a joke about an 18th century writer, Diderot. A joke made 50 years ago, not to promote violence, but to mock it and to power the revolutionary imagination passing by and inspire it toward peace. Let the left exist as it always has in your latrine of deceit, News Corp. Let the left exist as you always let it have, as it once powerless and as dangerous, as violent and as meek. Serve your master, serve your ruling class. Serve the smallest possible future you can imagine, one of privatised air, poisoned water, and a daily boredom so unstinting you come to welcome the pain that grips you every night. No one will thank you in this future, News Corp. But right now, I will thank this particular senator just one more time. Lee remembers Nakba Day each year. This year on Nakba Day, at least 60 people were slain. And I've really got to stop doing this to my notes. I do apologise. I'm a foolish lady. No, I'm just generally terrible. Just think revolutionary thoughts. As I find my place again. Look, it gets better. We've done Piketty, we've done the joke about the bookshelf. What I will do is try to collapse this bloody thing. Anyway, News Corp. Yes, the Murdoch record of imperialist excrement. The left, Diderot. You with me? Yep. Yeah. Right. It's all making sense? It's not too attention deficit? Okay. Yeah, the pain of future journalists. So Lee remembers Nakba Day each year. This year, on Nakba Day, at least 60 of Palestine's people were slain. More than 2,000 were injured. That's what I read this morning. I'm sure the numbers have grown. At the Gaza border, unarmed people gathered to protest, as should be their right. The US embassy's moved to Jerusalem. The IDF opened fire. Our politicians did say that the situation was tragic. They called for restraint on both sides. They were careful to use the terms Hamas and the two-state solution as often as they could, while Lee described, and this is on a website yesterday, the depth of the Turnbull government's unquestioning allegiance to a murderous regime. And just in case you were wondering, what Lee said is not anti-Semitism, and anti-Semitism is a real and present poison. And it is not even to declare that the Jewish people have no need of a homeland. It is simply to state the truth. Occupation is brutal, dispossession is a crime. To deny any person or population group the means for their survival is to deny the very stuff of oneself. We are, by nature, social. We are mammals prematurely born, and we depend on our social capacity to live as utterly as we depend on the land. We are all German Jews, said the people of Paris when the student Daniel Cohn-Bendit had been outed as a Jew by conservative Parisian press. We are all people standing here tonight on stolen land, never ceded. We are all with the people of Palestine, whose courage and strength must not be our inspiration, but acknowledged as their daily obligation. We are all for people whose power is made possible only through its shared and simultaneous use. We are all for those moments of revolution from the time of 1968. Mexico, Germany, Vietnam in the USA, Black Power, Brown Power, the anti-poverty movement, and here in Australia, Aboriginal land rights protest. These all occur close enough to 1968 that the 1968 metronym will have to do. What we're not for, at least what I'm not for this evening or ever, is a romantic view of the past. One crammed with student optimism, thwarted by the exigencies of real life. They all grew up and got jobs in the finance sector, don't you know? We are not for some numb dream of a time ended and a time in which compassion flowed like the finest hair extensions, Delta Goodrum ever wore. And we are not for a view of history as a static thing, as a memory of the good that exists largely to sedate our perceptions of this ugly present. 1968 was not bound to occur. 1968, being 1968, will not occur and will not occur again. Well, if it does occur again, you know, we know the famous line, first time as tragedy, next time as farce. 1968 is not a pure idea whose subsequent reality is eminently portable from Paris. 1968 is a big, chaotic, impure reality which actually happened, whose real and intricate history is not and was not an idea but was a complex of events. And the speed of these events are best described by a thing that Lenin never actually said, but you know, it's far too useful to ignore. There are decades when nothing happens, then there are weeks where decades happen. It's an inauthentic quote for my inauthentic version of just a few decades inside the weeks, inside the thing that we call May, Paris, 1968. So why Paris? Because I haven't read a lot of books on the Tet Offensive. If I had, I could talk about the extraordinary defeat by peasant guerrillas of the US imperialist regime, but I haven't. I don't know too much about Pakistan. I'm learning, but anyhow, we've all got Tariq Ali on YouTube. What I know a little bit about, just a little bit about, is the West. What I know a little more about is the tendencies and the techniques of Western media. What I know is that Paris in May of 1968 continues to the present to serve Western media with its images of revolt. And I'm guessing this is because Paris is such a telegenic city. Big civic spaces filled with fuckable young students, themselves actually not oblivious to the power of the spectacle. These all serve the need, the intrinsic need of big media conglomerates to reduce the real of revolt. And no, I'm not saying that media workers sit around and collude and say, what real moment in history can we diminish and fuck up today? It's an unconscious process, but it's a process familiar to any cynic who has ever worked in mainstream media. You sit there and you watch the structure of the real turned in to a pale idea. You watch that structure just fall into place. The ideology must be preserved at all costs. The rebel must appear on TV or on the Fairfax front page, only so we can all say, oh good, there's somebody objecting. The internment, the estrangement, or the hard injustice of our everyday has its brief, curated expression, and then the editor tells herself, well, I'm not part of the establishment. The viewer feels connected by this small, curated copy, perhaps of Paris, to a moment whose impetus is never explained. And this isn't censorship, and it's not propaganda. And it's not fake news, or at least it's not news that is consciously fake. The claim that Hamas provoked the IDF into shooting unarmed protesters is not fake news when the person and the organisation making it believes it to be true, and they do. The claim, often made by visual means, that May 1968 was the work of horny students, may be demonstrably false, but it's not fake. This is the story we've received in pictures. Young people went mad for new and kinky sex, as they are sometimes wont to do, especially in the springtime. They had no more lofty target than sodomy. Bless them, no, and all their French exuberance. And this year, Paris Fashion Week makes a splash with its 1968 themed show. Yes, that's entirely true. Let me quote to you from this year's In Style magazine, Maria Grazia Chiuri. I know we have some fashionistas here, and I'm sure I mispronounced that. The first female designer of Christian Dior opened Paris Fashion Week with a feminist bang on Tuesday with her 1968 inspired show. I've become quite uncertain about what 1968 means in the broader space, especially this week. There's been a lot of friendly media about it, but not as uncertain as I've become about the usage of the word feminist. Even so, Maria's work fell short of, I'd say, a Miley Cyrus interpretation of feminism. It was beautiful though. Beautiful models of improbable proportions wore impossible garments. And I felt, as I always do when looking at couture, some sort of strange relief that capitalism can still do dumb shit, can still fall into the very human habit of seeking and working toward unfeasible beauty that most know that they cannot replicate or afford, and the few who know that they can afford it understand that this beauty will never be reproduced. So really, as catty as it is, this promise of a feminist 1968 Paris Fashion Week, you know, even when it's tied so cynically to 1968, is a bit more honest than all the shit I've read in the past anniversary week about students, youth, optimism, sex, and profound naivety. These people in the media, these people that I work with, they don't mean to make Paris a museum piece. They don't mean to take the 60s and judge them kindly as an era in which we all threw off the yoke of bad old-fashioned morality, or, in the conservative press, less kindly and a bit more rarely, as the era in which rampant individualism, hedonism, and unconcern for God, decency, and strong foundation garments for ladies was lost. You know, this last view, the hyper-conservative one, I don't mind so much. It's such an injunction. So obviously the warning of moralisers, afraid not just of life and words and sex education in the present, but of an entire decade that occurred 50 years ago. That first view, that other one, it's more dangerous because it's part of that unified ideological promise, which somehow became more and not less unified with the advent of the internet, that thing that we all thought was going to be a great democratising force, that thing that now produces really just two opinions. It's the perpetual promise of freedom that rests perpetually undelivered. It's the appearance of democracy, but truly the adherence to an absence of, we might hope, what democracy means. It's a false reveal, this reveal of Paris 1968. and it's a predictable one, such as we might see on a competitive cake baking reality show or a competitive non-cake eating weight loss show. You know what to expect. Big fucking cake in the shape of Harry and Meghan. Oh, that's revolutionary, isn't it? Modernise the royal family, what a great idea. Or the big reveal of the suddenly thin. And you know what to expect when you see a headline about May 1968. Sexy student protest! Of course, the protest was not truly led by students. The charismatic young communist of 1968, Daniel Cohn-Bendit, a German Jew, we are all German Jews, he could make a good claim, if he wanted to, that his student action led to a mass strike by workers. I think he's agreeing now, isn't he, Lee? Students of every age, workers, they all joined this mass strike. Carers, persons from Algeria and other sorts normally refused classification by respectable history. And there, in the horrid outer suburban building of Nanterre, at the time an extension, a much lesser extension of the Sorbonne University, Red Danny, who actually seems more like an anarchist to me than a proper communist, persuaded others that this place, this monolith built in the US institutional style, I'm sorry if I'm triggering anybody who went to UTS, and in fact, a building being built still around these many, many baby boomers. It was crap back in March, Red Danny told them. And it was. It does seem a lot of his complaints had to do with his personal lack of access to the ladies' dormitories. And I'm going to spend this month reading, and I'm hoping to find an account by one of the feminists of Nanterre. I wonder whether they were so keen on having Red Danny in their dormitories. But, he could make a claim to starting the revolution, or the dress rehearsal of the revolution, as we should think of it. But he still lives and he doesn't make this claim. But what he does say is that he was exalted to be one among many. He said he felt that the vast sociology, which would have been then Marx's, they taught Marx back then, that sociology he'd been reading came to life. He felt young, he felt like an agent of change. But what he doesn't say in interview, and the guy doesn't strike me as a particularly modest guy, what he doesn't say is that his agency could have been felt without a mass. Because people of all kinds move together. Sometimes people do. The teachers' strike in West Virginia. Did you cry when you heard them sing Country Road, Take Me Home? You don't appreciate country music. I fucking did. People of all kinds moved together and things happened, and the people of Paris, millions of them, kept moving, and they shut a nation led by the authoritarian General de Gaulle right down. The weeks-long liberation of the masses was the temporary paralysis of France. Charles de Gaulle did say, after he pissed off to Germany, then came back, first in private and then in a more public presentation, that the people of Paris had shit the bed. I don't really understand French puns, but shit seems to appear a lot. Then he became more serious and he called these bed shitters tyrants. Like what our friend at News Corp is going to print tomorrow if they've got some empty space. The left is at once infantile and terrifying, violent and hopeless. with no ideas, but intellectual wankers nonetheless. So the people of Paris shit the bed, and then they became at once tyrants. He called these bedshitters Soviets, and this actually worked a little better than his previous attempts to control the protesters, now a majority of workers, with the hard apparatus of the state. And so when he described them as Soviets and bedshitters, 800,000 proud Parisians marched in their best clothes down the Champs-Élysées in full support of de Gaulle singing the Marseillaise, and in a simulation of protest against a Soviet regime that had not, in fact, reached Paris. He quietened things down a little, but the true end to the general strike, and this breaks my heart, was brought about by those who believed themselves to be truly communist. The Soviet sympathisers, the French Communist Party, the protesters had mocked for weeks with their cries, and you know this slogan, I'm sure, all power to the imagination. It was written to replace the Communist Party's slogan of France, all power to the Soviets. And those Soviets found all power, and they were the ones to help negotiate the end of the strike. The possibility of true change was not actually quashed by de Gaulle's government, but by other storied institutions. The French CP and a number of unions settled just for better worker conditions and did not power their own imaginations to the point of illuminating a better future world. So the changes took place. The career of the old general was nearly ended. He died shortly after. The Communist Party held on to the fiction that the best power was brute Soviet power and not the power described by Marx himself. The power he was led to describe from knowing what he knew about the Paris Commune. You know, freedom for each is the necessary precondition of freedom for all. A dictatorship of the proletariat, by the proletariat. The freedom to determine one's own freedom was sought and powerfully imagined by millions of everyday French people who learned decades of history in weeks and found the means to outlast a Communist Party whose imagination of the strike had narrowed to the point of statist control. And the story of these few weeks is enormous, and it extends not just back to March with Red Danny and the girls, but to the decolonisation of Algeria and to the birth of a truth that is regularly born. Occupation is brutality, dispossession is a crime. A colonial power, obviously this includes old us, must address its violence. Or, especially in France, a nation full of psychoanalysts, they'll eternally suffer the return of the repressed. I might be a bit repressed, but my imagination is not entirely powered down in this moment by the bright, sharp images of sexy young French served up to me by the fucking ABC. I don't think of what The Guardian writes. I think my own thoughts. I think of a very brief era in which people like Guy Debord, Jacques Lacan, Julia Kristeva, Michel Foucault, and others who impressed me when I read them first 2 decades later at Sydney University. Don't worry, I've got over all that postmodern shit. I think about these great, if postmodern, minds And I think about how they must have felt lost for the first time for words, because factories were closing faster than their exquisite analyses could take place. And Lacan's big other, the French government, could not even in a city made for surveillance and war, fix its gaze on all acts of insurrection in Paris and in France. Workers quit making planes. Workers quit making cars. The speed at which speed itself was brought to a halt by the passions and the hopes of the people is beyond the true grasp of even the truest intellectual, the best historian, excluding, of course, next week's guest, Gary Foley. He was there. The speed at which union members learned of their agency, of their place within a complex organism, the state and its partner economy, was fucking something. You think people are stupid? They're not. They can become politicised and intelligent in weeks. I talk to friends and people I know from the Black Power movement of around the same era here in Australia, and really, you must come see Gary next week. It was probably booked out. And you see people becoming literate, courageous, in a matter of days. So these workers, they understood the nature of the commodity, the nature of labour, and they voted against the Communist Party to extend the strike. I've spent the last few weeks reading the books on 68 by Chris Harman and Daniel Singer are especially good. And I can't say that this moment was bound by history to end any more than it was bound to begin. But it did begin, and then weeks became decades. And then those decades were bargained down by the Soviet orthodoxy to years or months or to weeks. The change of gradualism was won. And this change is not an idea or a spirit when it comes to the workers, but a real sense by real people, some of them still living, that their place within the state and its partner economy was one they could shake up any time. Workers' rights were lost. That vision of the power of the masses was gradually lost. And today we have Macron telling unions that they are tyrants shitting the bed, or something like it. The other week he called them professional troublemakers, which is sort of like middle management bed shitters, which is the mediocre sort of thing a mediocre liberal tool like Macron would say. There is so much chaos here in history, but much more created by my unsteady mind and my irregular reading of the events of 1968 than possibly by even the events themselves. It's a hard thing to get your head around. But there are, if you want them, many chronologies of May, factory by factory breakdowns. And there are many good minds who place the time within the context of the post-colonial. Frantz Fanon wrote on it, I think. There are people who place 1968 within the context of gender and of desire and of sexuality. Zizek goes on about it a lot, but I'm not sure what his point is. Always amusing, though. There are still fairly classical Marxists who call it a revolutionary dress rehearsal for the future, and French Marxisants who damn the Soviets as, by 1968, everyone really should. There are accounts of labour and of impromptu lessons created by the students, and of the way in which people survived, ate, lived without money. There were small zones in Paris in which capitalism did not exist. These zones existed. Perhaps, maybe even occasional small moments in which racism didn't exist. Perhaps them or their possibility opened up. All power to the imagination. All power to the people. Fucking none to the orthodoxy, and tear the media, the organisations that I work for. Tear it down. Tear down the media that shows us 1968 as an era without focus, as a time of naifs and horny idealists, and not one of scholarship in the factory and materialists on the street. Tear down those accounts that refuse to remember the great immobilisation of a nation of great industrial heft. Tear down the condescension of the nanny media who offers us France and Paris as the subjects of psychoanalysis in reverse, with its false light. Look at the rebels, they say, and aren't they adorable, and weren't they naive? To think, but of course, so many of them grew up to join the advertising industry. Blah, blah, blah. The actions and the transformations of many millions whose names we'll never know, those who participated in this shutdown. Paris was still, is whittled down to a few stories of youthful, sexy insubordination. Paris, 1968, the nanny media remembers it as a child shitting their bed. I don't remember it at all, as I was still rather inconveniently gestating inside another human in another hemisphere at the time, but in this moment, and I'm a cynic, but this is a time between times. This is what Gramsci calls the interregnum, when the old order is dying and the new is yet to be born. And in this time, morbid symptoms appear. One of them is Donald Trump. But I do sense something of the momentum that can happen. And I do find the accounts of the time, the good accounts, far less distant from this present than I ever have before, and I'm a bit shitty that I'm 50 now. I say this as a cynic, a person with extreme revulsion for her trade as a media worker. We are people in the business of diminishing the real and presenting profitable outrage as something other than the unproductive emptiness it is. So-called feminist columns of the present, those which complain about the lack of pockets in women's clothing, or the lack of mass-produced women's clothing in a particular size, or of the GST on sanitary items, why not fucking complain about the regressive tax that is the GST? The need for the Me Too movement, I understand that, but in all these months, the Me Too movement has not once thought to consider the exploitation or abuse of all workers as a matter for mass protest or action. No, we should crowdfund Tracy Spicer. She'll buy all the abused women workers lawyers from the private sector, and then we'll ask Big Daddy, the law, for justice. We'll look to inspiring, empowered celebrities for our personal inspiration as entrepreneurs. We will not strike, we're go-getters. We won't act socially, not truly together. We will now understand revolution, and it has been understood by my industry for so long. Fashionable, bold, ineffective, unfocused, sweet and full of inspiring close-ups. This is not to say that the pain of Me Too is not real. The hopelessness of the response is real and also, to me, painful. To seek a private legal recourse for all the many acts of abuse against workers of all genders is impossible. Not the fortunes of Bezos, Gates and Zuckerberg combined could buy that many lawyers. There's a reason that I'm talking about Me Too, and it's because I was reading a little more today, and then I know this date, May 10. On that date, on the Rive Gauche, the left bank, a crowd of great size gathered, and they built barricades, and they built these barricades from instructions left over from the Paris Commune. The idea of a dictatorship of the proletariat, this temporary autonomous zone that captured the imagination of Marx. And these kids, because they were still then students, they fought with police until dawn. This day, May the 10th, 1968, in which the General Reserve of the French National Police, big blokes equipped for riots, serious fuckers, they set upon the crowd. And this changed public sympathy for the mostly young participants. And then numbers swelled. No one organised it, but workers joined. Occupation of property that had been built by all these people and their ancestors. This occupation buoyed the people, and the barricades were built again and again as a symbolic dare to the police, who could obviously remove them. Then the barricades stayed in place. 50 years later, May 10, 2018, I went for work, mind, to see Secretary Hillary Clinton speak in Melbourne. A great crowd, overwhelmingly white, significantly female, stood for 90 minutes on a 5-degree night for their chance of what they believed to be revolution. And this revolution would mimic the many copies of revolution we've seen on our screens. Nothing new will be said, nothing old will be questioned. Clinton will make the same speech, which differs barely from her book and its various press releases, but this time with the help of Julia Gillard, with her new commitment to women in power. And this is the new revolution, as understood commonly in the media and by its friends in the white knowledge class. So we sat in this auditorium, us white women. We watched ads for finance companies, and these finance companies were then thanked by the ABC's Annabelle Crabb. She said, "You need generous sponsors to make something like this happen," which seemed odd to me when more than 5,000 of us had paid $300 each a ticket. About $1.5 million, not enough for Hills. I guess she needed to get paid a bit more than she did by Goldman Sachs. And she said, "More women in politics is the only way to get sexism out of politics." This is what Clinton says. She says it every time. And then we see Gillard's head bob, and the heads of all those other women, like the dashboard dolls of the motorcade Clinton is still so sore about missing out on. This is the limit of the so-called revolutionary imagination of the present. I'm not saying that there's no need for feminism. I'm not saying that Me Too is not derived from real pain. But you imagine yourself when you're in these places, when you're in these new, strange feminist protests. As a powerful woman, you admire Ruth Bader Ginsburg. You admire Gillian Triggs. I mean, she seems okay, but why? Why the heads of powerful institutions? Why admire the elites? Why aspire to be an elite where your unequal share of social power is a retort to your perceived gender inequality? You are never surprised when you hear in this new revolutionary MOOC resistance of a feminist space. And all the possibilities of a new real are abandoned in this space. So many women fail to truly occupy. At International Women's Day brunches, did a little survey this March. The average cost is $100. People like Lisa Wilkinson, Clementine Ford, Tracy Spicer traverse the country on that day and appear at so many of them. And we feel this in the anodyne columns of feminist Fairfax. We feel it in the simulated anger and in the real anger doused by the promise of a Tracy Spicer-led private legal cure. And here we are, and here I was with all the other white women on May 10, 2018, but we had no barricades. Instead, what we had, us white women, and we were so overwhelmingly white, what we had was the protection of brown men. Brown men who stood like dutiful, low-wage statues as one of the world's most powerful centimillionaires campaigned to sell her book, her myth, her possible presidential bid. The Secretary of State, whose hawkish interventions may very well have forced one or two of these many brown men barricades for the new white feminist. Hillary Clinton could have forced these men to flee. What must it have been like to stand for maybe $15 an hour facing us white women who turned pink with the thought that this proximity to Hillary magic, to elite power, may advance their own careers? All power to the imagination, but I can't imagine the depth of the indignity our minimum wage brown male security workers felt. But I can't imagine that I, or that many of you, will ever fail to see the divisions and the chaos that Fairfax, The Guardian, Netflix prefer to erase. I can't not see the difference between my dumb luck and those of a man who spent May the 10th, 2018, listening to a fan of extrajudicial assassination, a friend of finance capital, a woman who once promised Israel it would see its flowers always bloom in a desert of Muslim unreason, that smooth-talking, war-hawking, elitist shitstorm sham. And for this, and for her, for that kind of politics, these revolutionary women reserve their hope. And they hope for no end to the neoliberal age, just an accelerated version, by the way, of all the economic ages that came in the centuries before. And these women hope that they'll get the sexism out of politics, the sexism out of C-suites, the sexism out of Silicon Valley, and all those other important sites of concentrated power. Fuck the rest of you girls. This is the face of the MOOC resistance, the false 68, the human face of war crime. It's capitalist accumulation with a diversity twist. The end of this purported feminism, this liberal jamboree, is, I'm going to call it, not far off. I give the new ruling class idea of feminine virtue another year or two. I give Hillary no chance of the presidency, not at least without that powerful Russian intervention. That cost $100,000 on Facebook, along with sexism, lost her the job for which she was so brutally qualified. I give this transparent liberalism, unfortunately now so closely linked with women and the thing that I used to call feminism, the chance to die now, to quit mimicking the mukmay we've seen on TV, and to use its imagination for more than the acquisition of wealth and power. Or if not, if it refuses to die, unfortunately, I give this thing that we apparently must call feminism the catalyst for our own non-1968. Unproductive finance capital, wealth inequality, the impermeable smugness of a media class that believes it knows the difference between good progressives and idiot yokels. The image of Paris is pressed into the service of sustaining an unsustainable hope of wealth accumulation. The history of Paris is intriguing, but it's not our true concern. The possibility that our decades of inertia, in which the old order has simply decided to reconstitute itself as female and just a little bit diverse, remember to say the word intersectionality, even if you don't know what it means. This era, where the ruling class refreshes itself, reconstitutes itself, revitalises itself with estrogen, it will soon produce weeks in which those idiot yokels, my colleagues in media, take great pains to despise, speed like the factory workers of France, to a literate view of themselves within great systems. And this time, comrades, we will permit no authority to negotiate our decades within weeks away. Liberal morality is insolvent. It's a zombie bank of ideas. Clinton, Gillard, Macron, Trudeau, and all the male liberal allies of Merkel and Albright. Yes, I think those 500,000 dead children were worth the price. And Yellen and Sandberg, they are trading in the passion of zombies. And really, I have no fucking clue what will happen next. And neither do you. I mean, maybe Lisa Wilkinson will become Prime Minister and fucking get that really boring one from Pussy Riot to breastfeed her during question time. Maybe these charades by liberals of Paris-style revolution will work for another 100 years. Maybe every act of military violence will become acceptable if it's performed by President Oprah. Maybe the bombs of liberal women will detonate Palestine for good and with care, because we all know women make better leaders. And maybe Gal Gadot, the IDF Wonder Woman, will be the face of the world's incontrovertible currency. Maybe in 10 years we'll still be blaming Russia for the failure of a false revolution of which Clinton remains the figurehead. Or maybe we'll be throwing our sassy girl stilettos at the military prison in which Julian Assange will be contained until his death for simply publishing. If journalism is not a crime for Peter Gresta, journalism is not a crime for WikiLeaks. Think about the racism of that. We disdain those brown people who don't understand our Western ways and stop a journalist that, frankly, I'd never fucking heard of before. I'm sure he does good work. The problem was he was in an Egyptian jail. Julian Assange is unlawfully detained according to the UN rapporteur. He's a political prisoner. That he's detained in Britain somehow makes it all right. Maybe in the future we'll still believe in trickle-down wealth, trickle-down power, and the great need for those who have the most to command even more. Or maybe someone will just get the shits on the right minute of the right day. I'm not saying it's going to be Tarneen Innes Williams who'll tell us to burn the motherfucker down at just the right time. But I'm saying it's possible, and I'm saying it may burn. For the News Corp person, it's a metaphoric fire. You dumb counter-revolutionary fuckers. How do you sleep? Comrades, siblings, and that foe of all forms of leftism about to accuse me of being a tanky. Thanks to you, thanks to Lee Rhiannon, and decades can unfold inside weeks because they have to. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Helen. That was fantastic, as you can hear.
Can we just get the commie basher out of the way first? Working.
Thanks so much, Helen, as you can hear from the audience. So we've now got time for a Q&A, so we're happy to jump straight into it.
We're going to probably need to take that around. Or